Hello, I'm Terry Turner. Welcome to Studio 5. With me on the show today are Major Gabe Zinni from the Defense Media Activities Army Production Team and Petty Officer Kevin O'Brien, news anchor for TPC News. America is commemorating the 50th anniversary of the war in Vietnam. It's a time to honor and to welcome back all the men and women who fought in that war. Joining us today are 6 veterans of the Vietnam War who will share their experiences from the day they arrived to when they came home and in all the years since. These vets are featured in a 30-minute documentary called Veterans of Valor, which will be airing here on the Pentagon Channel. We'd like to begin at the beginning, going to Vietnam and first impressions for this segment. And I'd like to welcome retired Navy Commander Benjamin Morgan and retired Army Staff Sergeant Robert Thorne. Welcome to Studio 5, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Can you tell us just very briefly the circumstances that led you to Vietnam and what your job was there?
My name is Ben Morgan. I'm originally from Chicago. I volunteered for Vietnam. I come from a very large family. My father had 5 children in college at the same time, and to give my father some financial relief and also to get a better idea of what was going on in the world and also to earn some veterans benefits, I enlisted in the Navy. It took about 4 months between the time I enlisted to the time I was sent to Vietnam.
I was drafted into the Army in 1965, summer of '65, after completing high school and Fayetteville Tech Institution. I went to custodian class, and the day after I graduated from class, I was drafted into the Army. I went to Vietnam to the 101st in 1966, 1st 327, and I was in 18 Recon Platoon, which we were named Tagger Force. And I stayed there until January 67, I came home, and I went back to the 82nd Airborne Division, and from there, between the summer of '67, I went to Detroit Rides.
Yeah, pretty well-rounded. I think a total of 3 tours in Vietnam as well. I want to get back to that in just a little bit, gentlemen, but right now we have a clip from the Veterans for Valor documentary that we'd like to share. This is Marine Lieutenant Colonel George Brewer on what he saw when he first landed in Vietnam. Very powerful first impression.
My first day in Vietnam was very traumatic. I got there on a C-130. I went through Okinawa, left out of Travis Air Force Base. And when I came off the airplane, and we all lined up and we were all in formation. I was a Brown Bar Lieutenant Marine. I'd been through training, and I looked down to the left and I looked over to the right. And all I saw was rows of coffins with American flags on them. And I looked at the guy next to me and looked around, and I said, I guess that's what we're here for, huh? And it proved to be very true for a lot of us, and I feel like I was very fortunate to have survived. It was a sunny day, and it was very emotional to see those flags. And little did I realize how many of the buddies that I had gone through infantry school with and everything else may have been among those coffins going back home.
That was from a segment of the documentary that was subtitled Day One, and a lot of the stories that we hear from you and your fellow veterans in this documentary deal with how you hit the ground running. You came into the war the moment you set foot in Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit about your first day experiences?
Well, I flew to Vietnam from Travis Air Force Base in California, and we flew to Hawaii and then on to Okinawa. And it was rather interesting to fly in a chartered aircraft and move from culture to culture within 24 hours. And when we stopped in Kadena Air Force Base on Okinawa, you saw what looked like miles and miles of B-52 bombers wingtip to wingtip. And then to fly on to Vietnam, and as we're landing, you could hear the scream of jets going off to missions in various places in the country and even North Vietnam. You could see Vietnamese troops, there were Korean troops, lots of Americans, and there were also many civilians who worked around the airport. The climate change was very substantial, and of course we were all very tired from a very long plane flight. So basically, It was nice to get off the airplane, but it was all very strange, and yet it was all very exciting.
Your first day.
My first day in Vietnam, like you said, we flew into Travis, and then from Travis to Hawaii, and then Kadena, and then to Air Base in Saigon there, and went up to the replacement company. And during the transportation to the replacement company, we were hit. We entered the replacement company with a force issue of weapons and stuff to go to the field with. First day of Vietnam. But the second day, we were put on choppers and I was carried to the 101st.
Being in that environment stateside prior to going, where you knew someone that was either just coming back or getting ready to go, what were some of your expectations, in your mind of what you were going into versus the experiences that you got after you were over there?
Well, after being raised right there in Fayetteville, North Carolina, at Fort Bragg, I saw soldiers that came back wounded and soldiers that came back in boxes. But my perspective for that was I was going off to war myself.
Unlike the others that you'll see today, I traveled independently. The Navy folks didn't travel as a unit. So I flew in a commercial airliner, and I thought that what I was going to be experiencing was a smaller camp. And instead, Naval Support Activity Da Nang, where I was sent to, turned out to be the biggest overseas command in the U.S. Navy, and it was absolutely immense. So there was a 400-acre hospital. There was the largest service craft fleet in Asia. There were Navy ships bombarding. There were aircraft screaming overhead. There was the ebb and flow of people traveling to and fro in all sorts of military vehicles, and it was absolutely fascinating.
Before going to Vietnam, was there anything that you did, whether it was basic training or your school following basic training, that prepared you for what you were going to experience in Vietnam?
I did a lot of reading from various sources, what little I could find. I thought it was important before I went to understand some of the culture and the history of the country. A lot of Americans even today don't realize that Vietnam had won its independence from France in the 1950s, and that when our troops entered many of the villages early in the war, the people there spoke French. They didn't speak English. So you really had a situation where a lot of people were trying to adapt to a new Western culture as well as ours. And for our part, we are not real famous for our linguistic capability, and so there were issues from time to time where people had trouble understanding the other, which sometimes led to bad consequences.
Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Former Navy Commander Benjamin Morgan and former Staff Sergeant Robert Thorne. Thanks, both of you, for joining us on Studio 5. And coming up after the break, we'll have two more Vietnam veterans with us to tell us about their experiences on the ground in Vietnam. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Studio 5. I'm your host, Terry Turner. We're continuing our look back at the conflict in Vietnam and the Army documentary that was made about it called Veterans of Valor. We're going to talk now about the experiences from in the war itself, and joining us are two more men who were there, Army Colonel Richard Dianich and Army Colonel William King. Thank you both for joining us today. Gentlemen, can we talk a little bit about the circumstances that led you to Vietnam and what your job was there? You first, sir.
Sure enough, I was drafted after college, and rather than be drafted, I enlisted to be an intelligence specialist in German language because I had that in undergraduate. And I got the basic training, and the basic training commander came to me and said, "Well, Private E1, he said, you're enlisted to go to intel school." He said, "You're going to do that, but then you're going to go to Vietnam as a rifle platoon, or not a rifle platoon leader, as a rifleman." Later, I got the platoon leader thing. But he said, "They're opening up Armor OCS, and I'd like you to go." And I guess I was one of the more cunning looking of his privates. and I went to Armor AIT and Armor OCS, and 2 weeks before commissioning, the sergeant major, not of the battalion, of the brigade, came to me, and he said, "Well, cadet, where do you think you're going?" And I said, "I guess I'll be going to Germany or Korea, Sergeant Major. No tanks in Vietnam." There were, I think, 5 Sheridan tanks in the whole country at that time. And he said, "Oh no, you're going direct to Vietnam as a rifle platoon leader." So he said, "I have 12 slots for flight school," and he said, "You're going." So that was the HR system that sent me to Vietnam.
Colonel King, what's your experience?
Well, when I graduated from high school in 1963, I enrolled immediately in college, and I made a strategic decision. I could either go to Vietnam, because it looked like everybody was going to go. I could either go as a private or as a lieutenant. So I enrolled in the ROTC program, and when I graduated, of course, I was commissioned at that time, went to Fort Meade, and we were all waiting then for our orders to come. We anxiously looked at the mail each day, and then my day came. I can still remember the feelings.
Well, welcome back to Fort Meade.
That's where I was, exactly.
Now, in war, you're faced against an enemy, which is a challenge in itself, but also you have environmental challenges, whether it's the weather, the wildlife, just the climate itself. Can you explain to us maybe some of those physical challenges and maybe perhaps psychological challenges that you faced while there?
My responsibilities in Vietnam were as a supply platoon leader. And of course, we had to move supplies to get them to people or to get them to organizations that needed the supplies. So we were affected very much by weather because of flights. The roadways, especially during the monsoon season, would become almost impassable. And I also wanted to mention that, you know, I was in Northern I Corps, almost as far north to the DMZ, and in the winter season there, it was actually very chilly. You know, we had to, you know, deal with the moisture and then deal with the cold at nights. I mean, we slept under covers.
Well, Bill was quite far north, but I was further north. I was at LZ Sharon at Quang Tri, and it was supported 1st Brigade of the 1st Cav, and I was in Charlie Company, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, the stacked deck as a section commander. The leadership that we had in my unit in I Corps was so excellent, and you can hear a lot of military experts talk about how poor the leadership was, how ineffective the units were. But I can tell you, our leadership was just over the top. And environmentally, we flew every day. We flew at least 2 out of 3 days. And after a month, I was leading flights, maybe with 400 hours total flight time. But I did have 100 average in map reading in flight school. And that must have gotten to my commander. So I did that, and we had the monsoon, and it was freezing cold. At night, the officers are in 4-man tents when the division commander did not allow floors. So we'd go fly to warm up with the aircraft heater, a good move. And I want to talk about the jungle. On one, let's call it a resupply, rescue wounded, and take dead out from a firefight. It was in triple canopy, and I'd been there for some time. I had learned to fly, actually. And we went out there, and you couldn't even see the smoke coming out of the top of this. We use colored smoke to ensure you're landing at the right place, not the wrong place. And single ship go out and get these wounded, and they had to blow the trees in this landing zone. And you couldn't even see a hole in the top of it. But finally, we found the thing. The crew chief and door gunner, they're hanging out the sides looking for it. We found it, and we hovered down in it, and it took us 15 minutes to hover from the top of the canopy down, and when we got to the bottom, it was just crisscross blown logs. No security problem. They had a perfect perimeter around it. No, it's so thick they couldn't shoot more than 100 meters in that and hit anything. But we got down, and I looked up through the top window in the Huey, it's called the greenhouse, to see the sky, and I'm hovering there, and it was no sky. It was all trees. I mean, I'm talking about thick jungle. So another 10 minutes to hover back out with the wounded and a couple dead and go back. But the jungle had a huge effect on all of the ground and the air mobile operations over.
What are some of your recollections on, you know, what was new technology at the time and how it impacted some of the missions you were doing, and then how it impacted, you know, the war as it went on?
Well, I think the radio technology had improved quite a bit. What they're using now is far beyond that, but I had a couple of supply helipads that we had to keep track of aircraft coming in, going out, and make sure that things were staged properly for them to pick up and move out. So with the good radio communication, I mean, we never had any problems. I'll just put it that way. Everything ran real smooth.
Well, sir, I flew Hueys for 18 of my 30 years on active guard M day and active duty, and I never had a non-enemy induced engine failure. So it was such a great aircraft, and I crashed a couple of them, shot down. I'll give you the facts there, but never wounded in the aircraft. And you are protected by 40,000 inch thick T-70, 76 aluminum, but I was luckily never wounded. That my record on that aircraft was 9 rounds that one North Vietnamese soldier put into the right rear of our aircraft, hit the bleed band on the engine, blew the oil tank up, wounded my door gunner, and 5 rounds went between me and the co-pilot, who unfortunately decided he wanted to land. But we didn't land. We flew on 5.5 kilometers and crashed it on a fire base. But that air mobile technology, someone had the wisdom to make a good aircraft even better by going from the D series with only 1,100 horsepower to the H series. I think I had that in the other segment we did over.
Absolutely amazing. The Huey was just the icon of the war too, an amazing machine. Absolutely amazing story.
Let me tell you, I flew that aircraft behind enemy lines, and we're not talking about going 150 meters over. We're talking about going deep into Laos to insert and extract American Special Forces, 5th Special Forces Group guys. And I got shot up there several times, and that aircraft, I mean, streaming fuel out the bottom of it, the warning lights on. In one case, I had to chop trees down to rescue the, with our main rotor blades, to rescue the team. This is 45 miles, nautical miles southwest of Quezon in Laos. And the bottom of the blades were stripped of the outer coating. It looked like tinfoil, some kind of honeycomb on the inside.
Amazing story.
But it flew back, and they took the radios out of it and dropped it in the South China Sea.
Wow, absolutely amazing. That would be a show in and of itself. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Army Colonel Richard Janich and Army Colonel William King, thank you both for joining us today on Studio 5. Gentlemen, coming up after the break, saying goodbye to comrades and coming home from war, the emotional reunions with family, and also the protests and violence that a lot of veterans came home to. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Studio 5. I'm Terry Turner. Coming home from war is usually a joyful time, but coming home from the war in Vietnam was often difficult, with the nation bitterly divided and demonstrations and protests going on all across the country. Let's watch a clip now from the Veterans of Valor documentary. This is Staff Sergeant Robert Thorne, who was with us earlier in the show today, talking about his experiences each of the 3 times he returned from deployments to Vietnam.
Well, the only time I came back in '67, well, we was already told that what was going to happen to us when we arrived in the States. There were violence and people against us going to do what we were sent to do for the country. And each time there was something to come back to what was happening, what shouldn't have been happening. '67 was Detroit riots. I was in the 82nd, assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. I went up to Detroit when I came back home in January of '67. And when I went over for Tet of '68, I came back to DC riots, which were the riots they started after they killed Martin Luther King. And '72, when I came home, the country was trying to come out of Vietnam, so it wasn't a pleasant thing. There was not a lot of money, and there was homeless vets, and there was families without their dads, brothers, and sisters.
Joining us now are Marine Lieutenant Colonel George Brewer and Army Colonel Lars Larson. Thanks for joining us today in Studio 5, gentlemen. We saw that video clip, and of course, outside of the Civil War, there was probably no other time in American history when this country was as divided as during the Vietnam War. What was it like being a service member, coming home to that kind of division and unrest in the country you were fighting for, sir?
Well, for me, the most important thing there was I felt like it was an important purpose. And I was one of the only guys in my class, my high school class, that ended up going in the service. And my younger brother had to go. He was drafted. And one of the biggest challenges, not only there, but when I came home, was to take and convince people that it was really worth the sacrifice that we've made. And that was important. And I ended up being a recruiter. And the feelings, the emotions thereafter were just immense. And it was very profound, that experience coming home to the people who literally hated you, and said that you divided their families, and that you had taken and you helped divide the country because of what we did. And it was very difficult. But the most important fear that I had at that particular time was having a family when I came home. Because a lot of the men that I knew, they didn't have marriages when they came back. And their kids, in a lot of the families, I ended up burying a number of the people that as a CACO, Casualty Assistance Officer, some of which I had gone through school with, and it was very difficult. My basic school class was just decimated.
Sir, your experiences coming home to that kind of division in the country?
Mine was a little bit different. I was actually at the end of the Vietnam period. I returned in February of '72. My wife was in northern Midwest at the time. I was interested in moving to my next duty assignment, getting into school there, and moving on in my life. And I think that kind of characterized the rest of the country as well at that time. We knew we were leaving Vietnam, we were putting it behind us, and we all kind of said, okay, that's closed, let's move on. And I think everybody started getting busy doing those things. There were a lot of other events going on, a lot of space exploration that year. I think that distracted a lot of people from what was going on over in theater. And I think generally, though, people were just trying to move on. Let's get that behind us.
When you returned from Vietnam, did you feel, you had changed as a person, or, the experiences that you had over there, have they affected you, throughout your life and today, make you who you are?
I would say yes. I became much more tolerant. Little things didn't bother me. I can put up with a lot. I appreciate the little things in life. Warm socks, good meal, hot coffee, always good. And I think probably looking back, it did change me. Value things a lot more.
It changed me profoundly. I did a lot of reflection, and I wasn't a lemming when I came home. I wasn't somebody that just listened to what the politicians said and just followed them blindly, or the leadership blindly followed them. I learned that human beings are not infallible, and they make decisions, they take risks that jeopardize everything that I ever stood for, as far as my morality, all those types of things, that you start to question things. You're thankful. If it doesn't involve lives, it didn't seem like it was very important to me when I came home. I just saw too much, and saw the sacrifices that were made by young men and women that believed in a system that in many ways, they went to war, but the politics of it all were very disheartening. But that didn't take away from the camaraderie that existed between the people. I mean, these guys that I served with would die for one another, and they loved each other. And being in the Marines, which is a band of brothers, and it's just phenomenal, the camaraderie and the dedication to one another in a combat zone.
Looking at today's generation, the post 9/11 service members who have served our nation, Iraq and Afghanistan, Do you see any similarities? Can you make any comparisons to the war in Vietnam to current post 9/11 service members?
I think they, like I, when you return, you want to put that experience behind you. You kind of file it away and move on with the next chapter of your life. Not that you want to forget everything, but I think there are lessons there that you take forward and you move on from there. And when you can, you reflect on it, and sometimes you don't want to.
The haunting memories never leave. They're always there. And my own personal experience with the men and the men that I served with, especially the ones that never made it afterwards, that came back, that sacrificed or did their duty during that period of time, they were forgotten. And today I pray to God that we don't forget our guys and our families. And as you watch those wounded warriors come back at the Pentagon, and you see them come down there, and you see the children, and you see the wives, and you pray to God that they're strong and that the nation doesn't forget them because of their sacrifice. They went when other people were sitting fat, dumb, and happy at home, and only 2% of us serve. So there's a question, and I just pray to God we don't forget our servicemen that have sacrificed so much, especially those that didn't come home and their families.
Very powerful, very powerful. Thank you. I'd like to thank our guests today for this segment, Marine Lieutenant Colonel George Brewer and Army Colonel Lars Larson, and the rest of the Vietnam veterans who joined us today for Studio 5. And on behalf of everyone here at Studio 5, thank you all for your service. We'll see you next time on Studio 5.